So hello, I'm Ben. I'm going to talk about building a flexible analytics stack. I work for Mode. Mode is over here. I'm not going to talk too much about Mode, but if you want to learn more about Mode, we have a booth over there. More importantly for this talk, how do I do this? Ooh, there we go. More importantly for this talk, I am an analyst, which means that my job is to build charts and graphs and interpret visualizations, do a lot of the things that other folks here have been talking about. This is how I like to view myself, but in the sort of non-minority report world, I actually do more things like this, which is, I'm sure lots of people recognize, a lovely Plotly dashboard. And so, as an analyst for companies, this really isn't the end of my job. Visualizations and dashboards like this are very much a means to an end, and that end is, it's my job to help people drive decisions. It's that no matter how good my visualizations are, no matter how good my analysis is, if marketers aren't being able to run better campaigns, if product managers aren't able to make better decisions about products, if the sales team doesn't know which leads to call and which leads not to call, I'm not doing my job. And so that's kind of an important framing for all of this stuff that we do and all the things that analysts do is ultimately our job is to help people make better decisions. One of the big ways that analysts do that is through communication. It's through telling stories with data and turning that data into something that's actionable for business users. That's the thing that a lot of folks have talked about. A lot of people have already alluded to the value of visualizations in this communication and the value of visualizations as being a mechanism for telling stories about data. And to that point, there's a big difference between dashboards like this and dashboards like this. These sorts of things, obviously, the previous version obviously can communicate things in a much more engaging way. It does a much better job of telling the story and engaging your audience and ultimately driving a decision. I don't really want to talk about any of this. There's lots of people here who are very qualified to talk about what makes a good visualization. I am not one of those people. Listen to what they say and not what I say. Instead, I actually want to talk about what comes before these visualizations. And so there's a lot of conversations around how to make these things really good. And the way I think of them is, in telling these stories with your data, the visualizations are the characters in your story. But when you have characters in stories, one of the things that's also really important is they need backstories. And the backstory for visualizations is the data. It's thinking about where does this data actually come from? How do you actually build the data to build these visualizations? So I want to talk about where this stuff comes from. And if you look at this, there's lots of different things in here that it's not actually that obvious where you might get it. There's information here about tweets, the types of tweets versus followers, things about the devices for tweets, things about the customers that might be actually sending these tweets. There's a ton of context here that's sort of hidden. And how do we actually get this data to be able to tell this story? This is a little bit where Mode comes in. Mode is it's a tool that allows analysts to be able to create visualizations, to be able to share reports to the rest of their company. We work with a lot of companies on doing this. And so in part of this, we've seen a lot of different companies build different infrastructures for moving data around. We've seen a lot of people build these backstories around how they're actually going to tell these stories with data. And as a part of that, a couple of interesting things have emerged from it. One is there's a bunch of interesting trends that are starting to kind of grow up in some smaller companies and new ways of thinking about this that are worthwhile to talk about. And so that's one of the reasons I want to talk about this is there's a lot of these sort of new directions that people are going with this that aren't kind of the old school ETL ways. And so I want to describe some of those ways that people actually do that today. To set the context for that a little bit, this box is roughly where Mode lives. It's where Plotly lives. This is the analytics applications that a lot of people have already been talking about. Tableau, for instance, would exist in this space. These are the tools that people are actually using to create visualizations and to distribute the analysis that they do. The ecosystem that exists around this looks something kind of like this now. I'll describe this in a little bit more detail as we go, but this is what actually is required to make these visualizations effective. This is actually where things have to go in order for this stuff to really sort of be used to its full potential. So I want to run through kind of how this actually gets built and the reasons why it got built. And I want to talk about it from that direction rather than going through step by step of this is the first thing and this is the second thing, but rather talk about the story as to why you might build it this way. There's a lot of interesting things that come out of actually constructing this process. Part of it is you can understand some of the decisions that go into this and why certain things actually evolve the way they do. The other thing is we at Mode have actually built this system. Not all of it, and it's not perfect by any means. There's plenty of sort of hairy pieces to it. But this is a thing that we've actually been working on, and we've sort of learned some things along the way as we've done some things wrong. And so it's good to kind of have some of that background and see sort of the mistakes that we made and learn from how you can actually do this in your systems. So how does this all actually start? It actually usually starts with something like a business application. And this is the data that is core to your business. This is data for if your business is a retail business, it might be your point of sales data. If you're an application like Mode or Plotly, it might be your web application data. If you're a mobile application, it might be the data behind your app. It could just be sales records in Excel. This is the data that is very fundamentally core to your business. And the first things that a lot of folks do is they'll put some sort of analytics application directly on top of that data. They'll have data that's like, these are our bookings. Let's do some sort of analysis on our bookings and see how bookings are growing by day, or how sales are growing, or any of those sorts of things. Again, Mode is a tool that does this. Plotly is a tool. There are lots of others. This purple box is a very, very big and sort of rich box. But people will put data on top, put applications on top of the data that they have that's core to their business. So this is where things start. One of the things that we learned in the process of this is it's good to start small. There's a whole ecosystem that you may know you want to build. You may look at that and be like, I don't want to build this. This is like total crap. We have so much further to go. Let's not build this thing. Let's like build the infrastructure. But in reality, starting small is how you actually start to build that infrastructure, that you don't know the questions you're going to have down the road, and you can derive a ton of business value from asking questions of the simple data that you have. You can see what I'm doing a lot on Sunday night, that this character, despite not having much of a backstory, he's still a cowboy. He's still an effective character in this story. He's not as rich as he could be. You may want to do a lot more with him, but he's still someone worthwhile having around. And so that's where your data is kind of from day one. It's still worthwhile to ask questions of it. You should still dig into it, even knowing that there's going to be a fuller story later. So what happens next? A lot of businesses also have sort of core business data in their website. This is the data that is sort of how are people behaving on your website. If you're a web business or a technology business, this often is very fundamental to what you do. If you're a retailer, this may be fundamental to what you do. Other businesses, this may not be as important, but a lot of businesses care. The sort of secondary step is, what's going on with my website? How am I interacting with people who are visiting my site? The thing that people do with this, the sort of immediate step here is, let's put analytics applications on this. There's a lot of things that people are very familiar with in this world. Google Analytics, for instance, is sort of ubiquitous. Mixpanel, Chartbeat is popular among publishers. There's a lot of tools that plug in directly to your website and give you insights into how are people behaving on your website, what are they doing, those sorts of things. So this is a place where a lot of folks end up. You have an analytics infrastructure that's pretty simple, but can answer a lot of the questions that you might have initially. You'll notice, though, as you start to do this, particularly around this website data and this data that's powered by Google or by Mixpanel, these tools are very powerful. They do a really good job of answering questions initially, but all of these things are built in a way that's sort of predefined. They're not building reports necessarily for your business. They're building reports in such a way that you have sort of these canned ways of doing it. They give you flexibility, but you can't actually ask the deep questions you might want to be asking. And you certainly can't build the kind of really nice Plotly dashboards that we saw at the beginning. So what do you do to solve that? This is where what ends up happening next is people start to log this event data, start to log this website data into a central data warehouse, and then put other applications on top of that. So you may say, I want to take the event stream of people visiting my website, I want to pipe it into a database, and then start using Plotly or Mode or other tools with that database. At this point in the process of building this infrastructure, this is when things actually get really interesting and when you start to have to answer more interesting questions than just like, which suite of tools am I using? Because now you're having to have conversations about the technologies you're using. And there's a lot of trade-offs in the different types of tools that you might use here. So for instance, you have to pick which central warehouse to use. There's a ton of different options. You could have an entire conference about which ones of these people want to use. There's sort of the open source stuff like Postgres and MySQL. There's bigger, the sort of big vendors, Oracle, SQL Server, Vertica, things like that. A lot of those sort of modern analytics warehouses are Redshift, BigQuery. And then there's the sort of NoSQL warehouses with Hive, Spark, and sort of a whole host of other things that people might use here. There's a lot of reasons to make decisions on which ones of these to use. One of the interesting things that we've seen talking to a lot of our customers and a lot of the people who are really thinking about this deeply is a lot of people are starting to lean towards Redshift and BigQuery. Again, this is something that we can have like an entire conference about why you might do this. But this is what we see among a lot of our customers is these are kind of the emerging popular choices here. The second thing in this process, though, you have to do is you have to figure out how do I actually log data from my website or from the Google Analytics that I'm using into this warehouse. This is another place where there's a lot of technology decisions to be made. Some tools let you do it directly. Google Analytics, for instance, allows you to log things to BigQuery. Amplitude is a tool that lets you do some of this drag and drop analysis, but also lets you log data to Redshift. Then there's these other tools, Heap, Segment, Snowplow, that all allow you to write data, this event data, into a warehouse. And then a lot of folks build a custom build version of this, where they'll actually log the events themselves. Mode, we actually do a mix of these things. We use some of these tools listed here, as well as having our own custom-built event stream logging. And again, this is something where there's a lot of questions and a lot of technology questions that go into making this decision, but this is a decision that a lot of companies have to make. So then you have this whole system. This is where you are. Things feel pretty good. But the question you immediately run into as you're starting to work on this is, you actually want to mix these things together, that your business application and your central warehouse, you don't have that data together, and you want to be able to look at this stuff together. You want to be able to understand, oh, who's visiting my website, and of those people, who's buying what. And that may not be data that's immediately available from an event stream. It may be something that's tied to your sales data. So you want to pull that into the central warehouse as well. And then you have to build some sort of ETL process from your business application into this central warehouse. Again, there's a whole bunch of tools that do this. There's a lot of ETL tools out there that have been out for a long time. Then there's also a lot of more modern tools that are being built in the last 5 years or so. Here's a rundown of some of those. This is actually sort of a very partial list of what you can do, excuse me, what you can do with this. But there's a lot of tools out there to help you move this data around. One of the other things we did when we were starting to move this data that we really learned is it's important to do this one step at a time. That as you start to do analysis on this, you'll see stuff that goes wrong. You'll see data that doesn't quite make sense. And if you're doing transformations and extractions and loading things all in one step, it's very hard to parse out where something might have gone wrong and where something might have actually, your problem might be not that the data is wrong, but your problem might be the problem that the data is actually revealing. So it's important, I think, when you're doing this to think of this as something that's very componentized. There's a lot of moving parts to this entire process, and you want to think about them in such a way that if something breaks, how do you quickly identify what it is that broke or what it is that might not be working? And the easiest way to do that is kind of have these steps in nice, discrete ways rather than trying to mash a bunch of stuff together into one step. So if you're here, you're like, all right, I got all my data together. You may think you're good. You're not actually good. You're not good in part because there's a whole slide left to cover. But you're also not good because you've got data in a ton of other places. One of the things that's happening with the way businesses are run now is a lot of very core functions in the businesses happen in third-party services. They happen in things like Salesforce. Ticketing happens in Zendesk. Product management is run through Jira or Asana. Finances go through Square, go through things like Recurly. There's tons of ad services. All this stuff is like very core to how businesses run, but this data lives in some other place. And it doesn't live in your business application, it doesn't live on your website, but it still tells the story of how your business is doing. So the obvious thing you want to do here is add another ETL process to pull data in from these third-party applications into this same central warehouse that you had before. Again, the same set of tools as before. There's a lot of tools that can do this. This set of tools is actually probably bigger than the previous set of tools, and a lot of people do this in sort of different ways and in modern ways. But there's a whole set of technology choices around what you actually want to focus on when you do this. One of the things that we learned in the process of doing this is when you first look at these tools, it's easy to say they're all the same. They sync my Salesforce data into my Redshift database. Perfect. It's like, what's the difference between one and the other? The easy way to evaluate those tools is to look at the UI and be like, oh, this one has really good designers. This one looks great. This one has like really granular way to control things. The way to evaluate these products is to evaluate them based on the way that they produce the data that you ultimately work on. And all of this, in this entire space, and like these tools that move data around and ultimately are producing data, the core way to evaluate them is what is the quality of that data that you get. 95% of the actual work you do with these tools won't be through the interface or the actual application. It'll be through the data that it spits out on the other side. And so when we were doing this, we realized very quickly that rather than focusing on the application, we wanted to just focus on what it is that we as analysts would trust the most and what it is that we could rely on the most rather than what it is was sort of the most enjoyable to use when we're setting it up. So if we're now here, things are feeling better, but we also now run into another problem of we have a bunch of data from a bunch of different sources, and we as analysts are trying to figure out how our business is doing, defining metrics about it, defining ways to do this reporting. And it's very complicated to actually do that in a way that makes sense to everybody. You suddenly have lots of disparate data sources. People will define metrics in different ways. People will think of problems in different ways. And you want to figure out ways to standardize that. Very much like the talk from Elation earlier, it's very hard to understand what's happening in this system without a central way of actually thinking about this is what this data represents and this is what this data represents. You also have a problem with there's performance issues once this data gets very large. You have to figure out ways to make this something that's more performant so that business users aren't waiting around for their queries to run for an hour or so you don't have time to give an entire talk while your query is running. So the way that this also often happens is there's a transformation and aggregation process that you have to add on top of this. You have your raw data in your database, you transform it, you aggregate it, you reapply it back into your raw database, and that way there's easy ways, one, for you to run queries against this data, even if it's very large, and two, standardized ways to do reporting off of it. So, for instance, you're not having to say, I define new sales every quarter this way, and somebody else defines new sales every quarter that way. There's lots of small differences that go into this, and those are the sorts of differences that can really sort of undo your analysis. So now we have this system, and this system is actually fairly complete. We have a very good sort of backstory for our data, and a very good backstory for how we actually put data in a place that we can visualize it, that we can analyze it, that we can explore it. Before that, I guess one of the quick things is there's a bunch of tools that also do this. There's some larger vendors. There's also open source tools. Airflow is a tool that Airbnb built, for instance, that does this. There's a lot of people build custom-built applications. At Mode, we do this in a custom-built way. And some analytics applications actually do this as well. So anyway, so now you've got this system. Again, your backstory is very much it's filled out. You have a lot of data from a lot of different places. You have a sort of a full picture of what your business actually looks like. The problem there, though, is that, so you have a really good backstory, but you now have to think about where it goes. You have to think about what's actually happening next. Where does this analysis actually go? And regardless of how good your story is, regardless of how good your characters are, if you don't know where the story's going, you still end up with a crap story. So the way you can actually do this, the way this happens next, sort of the next step in this process, is to start pushing this analysis out to other places. And sometimes that's pushing it out to communication tools. It's pushing analysis out through email. It's pushing things and alerts out through Slack, potentially pushing data internal wikis and other places. It's also pushing data back into these third-party sources. That your salespeople live in Salesforce. If you want your salespeople to actually consume the data you're creating, they're not going to necessarily leave Salesforce to do it. For instance, we have our support team. We have a lot of information we want to surface to our support team. And they're working very hard to answer support questions, to help our customers out. They don't necessarily have time to think, hey, I should go look up analytics on this person as I'm helping them. So we want to make sure we're pushing that information back to the support team and the tool that they're already living in. So again, this is now you have to start pushing things out. Analytics applications can do this. A lot of custom-built processes can do this. We've built custom versions of how to do this at Mode. We have stuff that we run that actually pushes these things again to our support tools, to Salesforce, and to other tools, to marketing tools, marketing automation tools. This is a very powerful thing. There's also a bit more of a low-tech version of this, which is thinking about process. Analytics, regardless of how much we might want it to be something automated and something beautiful and technical, a lot of it is also just defining process. There were some talks this morning about how the human side of that is very important. And when thinking about people consuming data, process is a very important part of that, of like, what do people need to ask? How do they ask it? How do they consume this information? One of the things, again, that we learned in this is if you want your information and your data and your analysis to be consumed, if you put a ton of time into building a chart or a dashboard and you want people to actually read it, you have to be unavoidable with it. They're not going to come find it from you. I've built dashboards that I think are amazing and great, and nobody ever actually goes and looks at them until I start pushing them out to people. People are busy. People aren't necessarily that interested in coming to get your stuff right away. You have to make it unavoidable, and then they grow to rely on it. So this is where kind of this final system ends up. Again, this is something this general pattern is something we've seen emerge over and over and over again from a lot of different companies. Not everybody will work exactly like this, but this kind of structure is something that has become something that appears to be very popular these days. Now, you may be saying, like, I don't have that, I've got this. I've got just a couple things and a bunch of third-party applications, what do I do? Or you may think, like, oh my God, I've got this. Now what do I do? I've got 40 versions of everything. The way to start with all of this, you may be tempted to just say, like, burn this down. In some cases, maybe that's appropriate. But the way to actually start with this is just start by asking questions. You're not going to be able to build this from like a roadmap from day one. It's the sort of thing that if you try to go out and build this entire process and this entire infrastructure all at once, you'll often get there too late, where your needs are going to have changed by the time you build the thing that you want to have. So start by answering questions in sort of in an 80-20 rule. Spend 80% of your time working on things that are immediate, and 20% of your time thinking about how do I actually move this process forward in sort of a broader way. One, you can actually get business value out of that right away. You can start actually answering questions and moving your business forward immediately. And two, you're actually you're chasing a moving target with this sort of stuff. You're chasing a moving target with what the needs are of your business, what kinds of services your business uses, the needs of your business users. And so you have to be aware of that and have to be building a system that can be flexible enough and dynamic enough to actually fit those changing needs. The last little bit that I want to mention is, like, say you're an analyst and you're thinking, so you're this guy, you're thinking like, okay, this is great. This is not necessarily what I do. I just want to build charts. I just want to build dashboards. I want to build visualizations. In a lot of ways, that's not a job that exists anymore. This infrastructure, it used to perhaps be owned by IT. It used to be owned by engineers. This infrastructure is now owned by analytics teams. It's owned by data science teams. And so the question for an analyst isn't like, do I have to do that or not? It's, can I find what part of this process do I actually want to work on, and what kinds of jobs enable me to do different things in that process? So there's sort of two dimensions I think you can think about that. One is, how sort of new is the data infrastructure at the company? Is it something that they're just starting to build things out, or is it something that's very mature? If it's something they're just starting to build it out, an analyst's job is often, and data scientist's job is thinking about, how do I architect this system? How do I actually build all of these pieces in such a way that they can connect? If it's something that's already constructed, you're often thinking about, how do you optimize the system? How do you deal with scale? How do you deal with problems of delivering things at the right times rather than just delivering the right information? The other dimension is, how big is the team? For very large companies, you may be working on just components. You may be working on, I have to think about the delivery from this dashboard to the CEOs, or I have to think about, how do we move data from our website into our central warehouse? If you're working on a smaller team or a startup, you own the entire system. You're the person everybody's counting on to actually build this entire process, and so you get to work on the entire thing. So you end up with this sort of very, I expect, predictable chart, which is, depending on which quadrant you fall in, depends on the kinds of work you do. And notice that none of this actually avoids this system entirely. Like, you have to work on parts of this system now as an analyst or data scientist. You have to think about the parts of, where is data coming from, and think about where is that data going. So the final little bit of this, I think, and the final takeaway is, when thinking about this sort of stuff, and when looking at dashboards and thinking about visualizations and being an analyst and trying to present those visualizations, it's really important to know that story that you're telling, and know the data behind that story, and know which parts of that story are incomplete because you don't have the data, or where the data comes from. If you don't know the data, then you don't actually know the full story. And the best plots are ones that don't have holes, which that got about as good a reaction as I thought it was going to. So I'm out of Westworld slides, so that's all I've got. Any questions? Yes. Mm-hmm.
And then the next level that executives and people who use this data are interested in is getting more in real time. Is that something that's possible, or is more sort of middle of the day, what's going on in sales, question inquiry, always going to fall back on UI or whatever system?
The like latency of this, I think, is something it's one, the need for that is very dependent on the business. Some businesses, they're looking at sales by quarter, and if you can get them sales by month, they're like, oh my God, this is real time. Other businesses may be tracking stuff that they need to know within 10 minutes of what happens. So there's BuzzFeed, for instance, is a company that I saw a talk from someone who led their data science team that was saying they basically publish articles and try to make decisions on those articles, sort of the titles of those articles in 10 minutes. And in those cases, the real-timeness is very important. This infrastructure, the way this stuff gets built doesn't actually imply anything about latency. Sort of the more steps you have, generally the slower it'll be. But there are lots of ways to set this up such that these pipes can move very quickly. There are different tools that are designed for that versus ones that are designed for daily syncs or weekly syncs or hourly syncs or whatever that may be. But the sort of underlying architecture of that is often very similar. You might run stuff through different Amazon services if you're trying to do it in a matter of minutes or seconds. But ultimately, a lot of the pipes are kind of fundamentally look the same. A lot of businesses, though, for real time is something that kind of is a sexy draw, but a lot of businesses don't actually need stuff in any real time sense of if you're selling tires, for instance, it's difficult to imagine why you need to know the moment a tire got sold. Maybe I'm wrong, but.
Quick questions.
Yes.
So in your experience, what has been your hardest part of building that data?
A lot of these tools actually make it pretty easy. I think the biggest challenges are, one of the biggest challenges is actually thinking about the way you want to do it, is kind of making the decisions about the underlying architecture for it. Some of these tools, some of these like ETL tools now, you can plug them in and get them up and running in a matter of minutes. The thinking about which tool do I use for which service, how do I actually want to move that data around, what data do I want to surface to business users and in what kinds of ways, those sort of architectural questions are the ones that I think are actually very tricky. The other challenges of this are really around process. It's around, say we add a new service, we add a new integration, what's our process for getting that data on board? What's our process for explaining that data to people? What's our process for defining the new metrics around that? The infrastructure is something that's sort of a necessary step in that, but actually the sort of human side of this is something I think that's actually the hard part. Once you have a roadmap for the technology to do it, the tools now are clean enough that you can all build this, and if we knew what we were going to build, we could have built our infrastructure in a matter of days. But it was figuring out this is the stuff that we actually need. This is given the size of our data, the scale of our data, the questions about what kind of latency we cared about, this is the infrastructure we actually want. Mm-hmm. Cool. All right.